Hey, I'm Steve Lee, and I was a senior level designer on Dishonored 2 at Arkane Studios. Back when I applied for the job in 2013, Arkane sent me a level design test that partly involved me making a playable map in 15 days. In this video, I'm going to show you that map and then talk about it in a lot of detail, so I hope you're into it. I'm going to explain the brief that they gave me and how I approached it. I'm going to talk about layout design and non-linearity and the importance of good structure in level design. And I'll talk about how I appeal to Arkane's values in particular, but also give a few tips on how to approach level design tests in general. And here are two things that this video isn't. First of all, it's not some kind of cheat sheet for getting into Arkane. You know, this was about 8 years ago now, and I've got in touch with Arkane and confirmed that their test is really different now. The other thing is that I hope people don't come away from this video thinking that the amount of work that I've done for this test is normal for level design tests, because to be honest it really isn't. Especially if you're applying for more junior roles or on projects that are smaller than what a Dishonored game is. For what it's worth, having done a lot of level design tests over the years, this is the only one I've ever done that asked me to make a playable level and send it over for the team to play. And I wouldn't be surprised if they don't ask you to do this anymore. Also, what you're seeing here is quite a lot of work for just 15 days. I think this is partly because I'm very familiar with Half-Life 2 and its editor, so I could work very quickly. It's always strongly advised that you use tools that you're familiar with for these kinds of tests, by the way. But I want to say that I remember working really hard on this test, probably a bit too hard, to be honest. And I suspect that what I ended up sending them was kind of overkill. So I want to stress that I think the important thing about what I've done here is not the amount of work that I did, but how I did it, and the kind of level that I've made. Okay, let's get on to the brief that they gave me. As I've said, this part of the test was to create a short playable single player level in 15 days to then send it to Arkane and let them play it. This is obviously a big deal and very different to just sending over a document or even a gameplay video. They said that the level can be made in any engine or editor, and they mentioned Unity and the UDK, which is what Unreal was known as at the time, but also the Source engine and even the Dark engine, which is the engine used for Thief way back in 1998. So clearly they didn't mind old tools, they just cared about good level design that was relevant to what Dishonored is. The one design constraint that they gave me was that the objective for the level had to revolve around either eliminating or rescuing one or more NPCs. And finally there was the unspoken but kind of obvious goal that I'm trying to design a level that speaks to Arkane's design values. So, what were my responses to these goals and constraints? The first thing is obviously the time frame, because 2 weeks really isn't a very long time to make a playable level that you can just send to some strangers and have them play on their own. So even more than usual, I have to pick my battles, I have to think about what are the simplest things I can do to achieve something interesting and substantial, and I have to make sure that I have time to playtest and iterate on my map to make sure it's robust when I send it over. Having said all that, it's also really important to remember that they will know that 2 weeks isn't a very long time, and they're not expecting me to make something super finished and polished and amazing. Okay, the next thing was that the level could be made in any engine, and for me personally, it was a no-brainer that I make a level for Half-Life 2 using the Hammer level editor. This was for, I think, 3 main reasons. First of all, I'm very familiar with it, which will help me work fast. Secondly, for this kind of level design, I still think Half-Life 2 and the Hammer editor present the best suite of tools and content and features for me to make an interesting and fully playable level with. And finally, despite being a relatively linear and scripted game, Half-Life 2 does feature a lot of systemic gameplay features and values that overlap with the kind of games that Arkane make, and I'll talk about this later. Next on the list is the objective that needs to be about rescuing or eliminating one or more NPCs. And given that we don't have much time, and this is also a Half-Life 2 map, I decided to keep it simple and make it about rescuing Alyx. This makes total sense to me because Half-Life 2 already has systemic ally NPC characters who you can find and rescue and fight alongside, which is perfect. And finally, what kind of things can I do in a Half-Life 2 map to show that I would be a good fit for a game like Dishonored? What is it about Dishonored level design that I want to be able to show in my Half-Life 2 level, despite the difference in genre, because it's not a stealth game? Well, when it comes to genre, the thing is I don't see it in terms of stealth versus shooter. What I think is more important is the subgenre known as immersive sims. If you're not familiar with this kind of lineage of games, to me the touchstones for it are basically Thief, System Shock, Deus Ex, Bioshock 1, and Arkane's Dishonored and Prey. These games and the studios that made them all draw from a similar pool of design values that are associated with this genre, and it's basically what Arkane are all about. And I want to show that I understand this and can contribute to these kinds of games. So with that in mind, here are the 4 main things that I want my level to demonstrate an understanding of. The first values are those of player agency and player intentionality. The player agency thing basically means that I want the experience to feel like it's relatively player driven and there is room for the player to make some interesting choices. Whereas the intentionality thing is more about the player understanding why they're making these choices. I've talked about this in a section of my GDC talk on the holistic level design in Dishonored 2. But without going into too much detail, enabling player intentionality is basically about allowing the player to make conscious choices with specific goals and expectations in mind, based on their understanding of the consistent way that the game and its rules work. This is in contrast to creating a really scripted and kind of forced experience, where the player is dragged through it step by step, and they're doing things just because the game has told them to, and they don't know why. All of this relates to the next stuff that I want to show, which is non-linearity, multiple solutions, and systemic gameplay in general. I want the non-linearity to come in the form of both routes that the player can take, and also solutions to problems through systemic gameplay tools like the Gravity Gun and the ally NPCs. Making the best use of Half-Life 2's systemic gameplay features is not only going to show that I have things in common with Arkane and I have similar design values, but it'll also save me time because it's quite simple to implement and combine these things to create interesting gameplay opportunities. Other stuff for me to show includes creating an interesting layout that has some solid gating mechanisms and creates a kind of robust and interesting structure for the level. Gating is quite a fundamental level design term for all the things we do to keep a player in a certain part of the level or the game until they complete an objective or do something to unlock it and progress. These gates and obstacles that the player has to overcome somehow form a big part of the objectives that the player has in their head as they play the game, and therefore play a big part in shaping the experience as a whole. I basically want to show Arkane that I know what I'm doing when it comes to creating an interesting series of gates for the player to progress through. The final thing is that I want to show that I can create some reasonably believable interiors and exteriors that are connected in interesting ways. I don't want to create a level that is completely just interiors and corridors and rooms, but I also don't want to create a level that is just exteriors and running around in streets and buildings that you can't go into. I want to create a level that involves weaving in and out of both, which Dishonored does really well. The interiors and exteriors often relate to each other in really interesting ways. Okay, so those are the things that I decided were the most important things for me to show. Here are a few things that I decided weren't important and that I shouldn't spend very much time on. The first thing is real stealth gameplay. There are some ideas and little tricks and stuff that I can do to create stealth-like situations, but ultimately I'm definitely not going to bend over backwards to try and make Half-Life 2 into a stealth game. The second thing is that I'm going to keep most of my encounters quite small and simple. Instead of trying to implement any big flashy action set pieces or really involved stealth gameplay situations, I basically want all the other stuff I've talked about, like the non-linearity, the systemic gameplay, the gating and structure stuff. I want this to be the focus, both for me while I'm making the level and for them when they're playing it. And the last thing that I decided wasn't important was any kind of visual polish. This is partly a time thing in the sense that I don't have time to make anything look really nice. But it's also not really what level design is about. And when it comes to dressing up the environments, I've just done a basic pass so that you can see the kind of spaces I have in mind, and also see that I'm thinking about fairly realistic spaces as I design, and not just making spaces that are, super abstract. Okay, that's the kind of stuff that was going through my head during the planning phase. Now on to the main course, where I show you a playthrough of the whole level and give a kind of developer's commentary on the whole thing. Here it is. So the most notable thing about this start location is that it's on the 3rd floor of the building. There's not really anything to see or do in this room other than to walk outside and hopefully be drawn to this scene that I've scripted on this bridge. We see Alyx being led from one building to another by these 2 combined soldiers. There are 3 things about this scene that are intended to draw the player's attention to it. First of all, you can hear the dialogue from the combined soldiers as soon as you step outside. Secondly, most of the space of this walkway that the player is standing on leads to the left, which is in the direction of the scene. And finally, the player is up on the 3rd floor of the building because I already knew that the scene was going to take place on the bridge, which is on the 3rd floor. So the scene that I want the player to see is the only thing that is moving in the level. It's on a very distinctive bridge and it's at the same height as the player. I use this scene to set up the objective, which is to rescue Alyx. And it might seem like nothing, but to me already this intro is relatively Arkane-like. I've tried to show a little scripted narrative scene without taking control away from the player, and that objective is also a very clear and high-level one. And I leave it up to the player to decide and discover how they're going to do this on their own terms. The fact that I've given the player a ladder to get down to the ground floor with kind of makes me laugh now, because I now know that Arkane actually have their design values posted up on their walls in the style of motivational posters. And somewhat jokingly, one of these is actually fuck ladders. This is because of the common problem of players accidentally jumping off them or falling from the top of them and dying. So after climbing down this ladder very carefully and not falling to my death, another simple but significant choice that I made at the start of this level was to not give the player a weapon, which made sense to me for 2 reasons. The first thing is that when I'm on such a short time limit to make a fully playable level, one of my first questions is, what can I do that's really quick? What can I do to make a level that feels like a level and has a beginning, a middle, and an end? Not giving the player a weapon to start with is an easy way to make the beginning of a level feel different, because it makes the player feel more vulnerable and makes the first objective to find something. The other thing is that I think it makes it feel more like an Arkane game. Instead of the player just starting the level guns blazing, we begin with exploration and getting to know the place that we're in. I deliberately placed this staircase in front of the ladder that the player climbs down. And for players who investigate this, here's a tease of the first weapon. I show the player the gravity gun sitting in a room that they can't currently access. The idea is to make players wonder how they can get in there, and also to signal early on to Arkane that this is a non-linear level that rewards exploration. As we head back upstairs, let's have a look at the general layout of the level. We're in a street and there is a Metro Police Combine guy over there. And ahead of us we can see that the building that Alyx was led into is blocked off by a Combine force field. And the same goes for this route under the bridge here. But notice how this layout has the player kind of in the middle of the level with everything else surrounding them. And remember the intro scene where we saw the Combine soldiers leading Alyx from the building on the right to the building on the left. The combination of this scene with this layout pretty much tells you the structure of the entire level. Because now, even without any UI marker on Alyx telling you where she is, we know that she's been taken into the building on the left, and that to get there, we probably need to go through the building on the right. We can also see that there are 2 ways into this building. One of them is the staircase down here, and the other one is the door with the guard in front of it. So now the player has to explore and come up with a plan. Here's what happens if we approach this guy. He's blocking the door, and he pushes us away. This is where I want to talk about an important level design principle known as showing the door before the key. To me, the clearest, old-school classic example of this is Doom, where many levels feature coloured locked doors which need the corresponding key to open. And this is like the textbook gating mechanism that gives the level a sense of structure and creates some new objectives for the player to search for the keys. And a basic part of this idea is that it makes sense for all kinds of reasons to show the locked door before you present the player with the key, because otherwise the player picks up the key first and then they reach the locked door and they just open it, and there's no new objective and there's no exploration for the key. Now that might seem obvious, but particularly in non-linear levels, it's actually quite easy to accidentally create situations where this is maybe the case. I actually did it myself in this level, so I'm going to talk about that later. Anyway, back to the level, and I've essentially presented the player with 2 locked doors to get into this building. We can't know for sure exactly how the player has played the level so far, but we know they're going to bump into one of these locked doors at some point and wonder how can they get in. And at the far end of this courtyard, which is the area the player is most likely to find last, is a dead civilian next to a crowbar. So now the player has options. They essentially have their key to the building. And the obvious option would be to use this crowbar to attack the Combine guy. But we're not going to do that. We found the staircase near the start of the level that leads us to the Teasing the Gravity Gun, and we're going to go this way. And this feels quite nice because we're kind of rewarding the player for exploring and being observant earlier in the level. Another nice thing about this option that we've presented to the player is that it gives the sensation of being stealthy, despite Half-Life 2 not actually having many stealth mechanics. The player is able to choose not to take that guy head on and kind of be smarter about it. So you don't need to be a stealth game to do this kind of thing. I chose to give the player a gravity gun here because it's the most interesting one in terms of systemic gameplay, basically turning lots of physics objects into potential tools and weapons. This has the cool effect of basically making the rest of my level more interesting, because suddenly any of these physics props that I can place are improvisational gameplay opportunities for the player to look out for. So this is another nice example of a design choice that is really simple and quick to implement, but brings a lot to the table in terms of adding systemic gameplay to the level. Taking that guy's ammo and checking to see if there's anything going on outside. Nope. Getting stuck on the wall. In this next encounter, the first guy has his back turned to us, which is quite a Dishonored-like thing, you know, just to make sure that this is a player-initiated encounter and not something suddenly sprung upon them. Again, it's another little example of how you can do simple little things to try and squeeze some stealth-like gameplay out of an action game. Next, we encounter our first systemic ally NPC. We have a locked door and a keypad next to it that we can use to unlock it. And we meet this guy.
Dr. Freeman.
I've added this civilian in early on in the level for two main reasons. First of all, these civilians are yet another simple way of adding systemic gameplay to the level. These guys are cool because you just plonk them down, and not only can they follow you and fight alongside you, but you can tell them where to go. You can make them move to wherever you're looking, like this, but then double click that button to make them follow you again. These allies are so systemic that it's practically no work to implement them, you literally just place them in the level. And given that I'm on a very short timescale, that's perfect. The second reason I added the civilian early on is because he effectively acts as a tutorial for when you rescue Alyx later in the level. This means that in the finale of the level, when you're fighting alongside each other, you already know how she works and what to expect from her behaviour. We're approaching the next encounter, which happens on the next 2 floors. Here the player can look through this door and just about make out that there's a Combine guard with his back to the door. So again, we're setting things up to allow the player to observe a situation and gain a tactical advantage from that. Here you can also see 2 more guys, and in Dishonored, you can imagine that these 2 guys might be having a conversation. This often serves a double function of being used to convey some narrative, but also warn the player and allow them to hear the enemies before they're able to be spotted by them. We could attack now, but we're actually going to go upstairs and see if we can get an even better view from there. So it's quite a small detail, but on this floor, there's a door there that we just saw on the left that is locked. And if the player starts this fight without touching the door, as we're going to here, somebody actually kicks it open. So watch this. Somebody on the left off screen, unfortunately, in this playthrough, actually kicks that door open and attacks us. And here's what it looks like if I start by trying to open that locked door instead. I scripted it so that the enemies below hear this door being kicked open, and this kicks off the fight in a different way. I had reservations about it because I thought it might be a bit of a nasty surprise, but in the end I just thought it was a nice little detail and it was worth keeping in. But now, onto something that maybe kind of was a problem, in theory at least. Remember earlier when I was talking about showing the door before the key, and how it would be weird if it was the other way around and you could just arrive at the door with the key and open it straight away. Well, I've kind of done that by accident here, because in the next area, we come to another gate, which is this combined force field that blocks us from crossing the bridge. So now we need to figure out how to turn off this force field. This is the first time that I ask the player to figure out how to turn one of these off. And the clue that I've left is that the force field is connected to this terminal, which in turn has some cables coming out of it that run across the floor and into the area below. This leads them to another terminal which has a switch on it, which they can use to turn off the force field. So you might be asking, what's the problem? This seems like the kind of simple puzzle or gating mechanism that you would find in a Dishonored level. So it seems okay, right? The problem is that the player is likely to finish this combat encounter in the area downstairs where the switch is. And if they found it, which would be likely in a real game if the switches were made clear, then they would turn off the force field and go upstairs and it would already be off, meaning they've accidentally skipped the puzzle rather than intentionally solving it. This isn't a disaster in the context of this test, but it's the kind of thing we should be conscious of as level designers. Arkane's lead level designers actually asked me about this, and my response was just to be honest. I said that I knew it wasn't ideal, but I didn't have time to address it, and that was okay. So my advice would be that in this kind of situation, you can just be honest and humble, and there's no reason to get defensive about your work or pretend that you're some kind of magical level design Yoda who gets everything right the first time. These kinds of little quirks in level design tests are often just a good conversation point and an opportunity to show that you can talk about things, take feedback, and collaborate on solutions. The other thing is that, like I said earlier, in a level design test on a time limit like this, nobody's asking you to make anything perfect, so don't worry. Okay, so with the force field down, now we've got to deal with this turret at the end of the bridge. As always, I've tried to make sure there are multiple solutions to this kind of obstacle. So I've given the player grenades, which they can use like this. But I've also placed lots of heavy physics objects in this room, which the player can use with the gravity gun to shield themselves as they cross the bridge, and then use it to take out the turret. This is another example of what I mean by the gravity gun being a great source of systemic gameplay. Now that we're across the bridge, it's quite a simple and short and direct combat section on the way to Alyx. The player doesn't know exactly where she is, so I don't want them getting lost on the way. Not to mention I'm probably completely running out of time by this point. That was a second turret in the next room, which implies that Alyx might be behind that door. And here we just have a nice little second challenge for the player to take out a turret, this time in a different kind of space. Again, really cheap and simple, but does the job. And there we go. The turret finishes going a bit crazy and explodes. And now we can free Alyx. She's behind this door, we can unlock it in the same way that we did the last one.
Gordon.
Something that I maybe should have mentioned earlier is that throughout this level, I'm trying to be quite generous with health and ammo, because, this is a level design test, and it's not in anyone's interest for me to, punish them with my super hardcore Dark Souls map. I want them to be engaged with it, like they would be in a real game, but I also want them to be able to glide through it quite comfortably so that they can focus on the level design. So I added checkpoints and gave them loads of health. Okay, so now there's an objective update, escape with Alyx under the bridge, which the player might have seen at the start of the map if they were looking around. For this final section, I ended up supporting 2 routes to finish the level with. The main one that I created was to go down these stairs with Alyx. We encounter a few more Combine guys here, and we have this nice height difference of us shooting down at them. It's interesting how just that small height difference can make it feel quite empowering. It gives it a nice kind of breaking out of prison vibe. But then when we step outside, it's quite different. It feels more oppressive. We're in this very tight area with a force field blocking us in, and we need to take cover. Here I've scripted Alyx to disable the force field when you've taken out a couple of enemies, and she T-poses here for some reason. There. So you can see that my scripting here is a little rough, but as I said at the start of the video, that kind of visual polish is not important to me at all in the context of this test. What is important is the level design and the clarity of the ideas that I'm trying to convey. Now Alyx is disabling the final force field, allowing us to escape under the bridge, and that's the first way to finish this level.
We did it, Gordon.
But I made a cool little discovery when I was testing this, because I realized that once they've rescued Alyx, instead of taking this route to the right that I've created over here, they can actually just run over the bridge back where they came from and escape with Alyx that way. Initially this struck me as maybe a potential nightmare because it's another thing I have to take into account and I was running out of time. But it turned out because of this very condensed kind of circular layout, the new wave of enemies that I've placed for the standard escape route still work for this route as well, and it's kind of cool because you get to see it from a different perspective and feel like maybe you're outsmarting them. So I was really pleased when I discovered how much this second route adds to the finale of the level, and also how relatively simple and cheap it was for me to support it. I did spawn a few new guys here to create this nice vertical fight down the stairs. but everything else is the same. And now I'm going to fast forward a bit through the rest of the level. We fight our way out of this building, back into the streets, finish those two guys off, and we escape under the bridge again with Alyx. And as a final point, now that you've seen the whole level, I want to zoom out and show a top-down view of the whole thing and discuss the very high-level layout. Seeing the map from this perspective, you can see that the layout is basically a square. And if I was to draw a line to trace the player's route that we've taken through this level, it would look something like this. And the thing about this layout is that it's roughly 10 minutes of gameplay that I've packed quite densely into a relatively small space. It hopefully feels like the player is genuinely exploring a place, instead of just walking down a long video game roller coaster tunnel. And to me, this is quite central to how Arkane games feel to play. They encourage you to immerse yourself in a location and explore it in a very non-linear way, pushing against the boundaries,
no guests past this point,
and revealing new layers to the locations the more you explore. So the kind of layout that I went for is partly to echo the kind of thing you'd expect from Dishonored.
You're a scandal in that mask. I like a man with poor judgment.
But it's also just a matter of time and working efficiently. Because by designing a space that the player traverses in a non-linear way and they kind of go back and forth a lot, I'm also just saving myself time. I'm getting a lot more gameplay out of a smaller space, which is always a good thing. So I suppose the takeaway is that you should be really focused on what you are actually trying to achieve, and don't make things hard for yourself by doing more than you need to. Ultimately, the more focused you are and the more you keep your scope in check, the more time you have to iterate on things and make things as good as they should be. And that's the end of the video. I hope you found this interesting and useful. You can let me know in the comments. Feel free to share it around if you know people who might be interested in this, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. That's all for now. Cheers for watching. See ya.